If you are familiar with the names Will Durant and Ariel Durant, I'm sure you would know them through their 11-volume book series called The Story of Civilization, which is an absolute treat for those who are interested in Western philosophy and history, in fact, all of human history and philosophy in some ways. And if you're not familiar with these names or these books, then I'm sure you are in for a treat. These books, 11 volumes, surely it's going to be a long read for you. But in many ways, it's quite educational. And if you have some time, which I hope you do, given the pandemic situation all over the world, it's a really good time to familiarize yourself with the history and philosophy of the Western world. And in today's podcast, I'll particularly talk about the 10th book in this series, which is called The Lessons of History. So if you follow these authors' works, you would find that they are trying to make us understand why something has happened and how it has happened. And it's kind of a way for us to learn and understand how one thing could lead to another and how history is being played out in front of us in many ways. Like all other books, this too is quite an interesting read. Although there is so much to cover, and the book spans around 5,000 years of human history, yet it moves so quickly that you hardly get a chance to recover or pause anywhere. And it does so in a multidisciplinary kind of a manner, where they analyze the biology, sociology, politics, history, art and culture, and they use a particular lens to view all this history, which is very much based under the assumption that there were certain reasons why something happened. And a lot of other historians or philosophers might not take that view, and might leave a lot of things on chances. But here the authors, they are pretty much insisting on this, that there is a reason why one thing happened and not the another. So based on the ideas in the book and the arguments put forward, I'm going to derive certain lessons here and share them with you. So let's start. One of the lessons that they talk about is about the geography and its role in civilization. You can think about any place, your hometown, and think about its geography. Is it close to a river, sea, or a lake? And based on that, think how it is connected to the outside world. And when you think along those lines, you realize how certain places in the world developed and how civilizations developed along those lines. We have so many examples of that. For example, Mesopotamian civilization. This was established between Euphrates and the Tigris River. Then you have the Indus Valley civilization, which was, of course, along the banks of the river Indus. And so was the story with ancient Egypt or ancient Rome. The rivers and the geography, it played a huge role how certain places or certain civilizations they grew. But the authors also remind us that This mattered until now, when technology wasn't really advanced. And now, when you have a really powerful technology, the geography doesn't really matter. In fact, it can go the other way around. In places like where you don't have anything, places like in the Middle East, in Arabia, you can develop high tech cities like Dubai. So, the commercial advantages that many civilizations and countries had in the past, for example, India had a few millennia back, or Europe had a few centuries back, that is withering away. And now, with technology, this geographical factor is not really a big concern. Another powerful idea that the authors talk about is the equality. Along this idea, you will find a lot of debates on political left and right hand side. People on political left would insist that we are supposed to be equal, and for that we need to have those policies so that everybody gets equal chance, everybody eventually leads a life that does not gives rise to any inequality. But the authors here argue that humans are born unequal, and life is a competition. And no matter what we try to do or take certain measures to equalize certain factors, we are not going to achieve that. Because from the moment we are born with certain genes, and right there begins the inequality. My genes would be different than yours. They might be suitable in certain tasks, in certain conditions, and so would be yours. But they won't be equal. This is an argument which you would have heard from people on the right, somebody like Thomas Sowell. He has made that point repeatedly. And the similar point about left wing and right wing divide, the authors make here that you can have freedom or you can have equality, but you can't have both. If you let people be free, some people are going to do better than the rest. Some people are going to achieve more than the rest. So you'll have to suppress their freedom to some extent, depending how much equality you want, and then you will achieve equality. So there is a trade-off between freedom and equality. So that's how the political divide goes. The political right, it strives for freedom. Political left, it strives for equality. Then the authors talk about how little we have got anything to do with our race, our biology, and how much more it's got to do with our customs, social conditions, and the cultures we live in, especially our personalities, our morals, and the things we believe in. It's got much to do with our culture. Especially if you consider the recent history. It's a long history in some ways, but in terms of human history, it's a very short span of the civilized world. Let's say the last 4,000, 5,000 years. So in this period, human evolution has been mostly social, not biological. So if someone from ancient Greece, that person travels in time to our modern world, that person would be quite similar to us physically, but dramatically different culturally. And how does cultural innovation or cultural evolution take place? It's a result of trial and error. Innovative individuals and groups, they put new ideas into society, they test them, If a majority of people like them or adopt them, they start following and eventually society evolves. But it's mostly trial and error. And this is how religions came into being. And they had powerful ideas which stuck with humans, and they carried on with these ideas for a long, long time. And the same is story about our ethical values. They are also a product of historical conditions, and they also change over a period of time. In fact, much of the morality and ethics you see around depends a lot on the conditions that you have around us, social conditions, economic conditions. For example, in the hunting phase, male humans, they had the responsibility to hunt. So the death rate among males, that was very high. And that meant there were very few men. And therefore, a man was expected to reproduce with several women. So you would find in those periods, greed, brutality, and sexual aggressiveness, they were advantageous in terms of surviving mechanism in a man's life. And in fact, men were respected for having those kind of traits. But as societies grew after the agriculture revolution and new societies emerged, then men were supposed to be industrious, cooperative, and more peaceful rather than being aggressive. And this shift is still taking place right in front of our eyes. We are seeing how, with the advancement of technologies in terms of female health, we are seeing more and more women, they are participating in the workforce, and that is changing how we view the world. So workforce behavior and how we see the role of gender, that is changing. So all kind of morality or points of views, they are changing along with the developments in the society. Then the authors make a particular point about the Catholic Church, but I feel that's also valid for almost every other religion on the planet. The authors say that the church has lost its moral authority, but it survives because it provides hope for the desperate people. And that's truly where we are. People these days, they realize that if they've got any medical emergency, they need to go to the hospital instead of a shaman or any religious figure. They very much know how to have a moral code, how they can educate these values through school education. No God has to define it for them, and no God has to help them in their crisis. But still, they need hope. They need hope as a last resort when they are truly in a sad situation or a desperate situation. And that's how religion survives even in today's age. Then at some point the authors also talk about the idea of socialism and how the redistribution of wealth must occur. They make a point that the concentration of wealth is pretty much a natural process, but it can only be prevented through compulsory redistribution, because the authors argue that when a society's concentration of wealth it hits a critical point, redistribution must occur, because otherwise, if there is too much difference in the rich and the poor, the latter may turn against the former, and some kind of revolution or revolt that may occur. But it's a very tricky question, because authors at the same time argue that socialist experiments throughout the history they have failed, and there is a definite reason for that. And the reason is pretty simple. When you're going to do this kind of redistribution, you're going to take away people's freedom, and they don't like it. And that's probably the most important thing for people to have, their freedom. So how can we have socialism and still not take away people's freedom? And that's why the authors suggest that we must pair socialism with capitalism. And that is something we are doing at the moment in many societies. On one hand, we are encouraging capitalism, all the enterprises. At the same time, we are trying to redistribute wealth through certain welfare programs, by funding certain education institutions or medical institutions. Eventually, authors also talk about one of the founding values of modern civilizations, and that is the question of democracy. Democracy, as many people say, and authors agree, it is the best form of government that we have at the moment. But they also remind us that it is a fragile system and requires an educated population. But that's a very tricky thing, especially if you consider the developing world. And how do you go about that? How do you establish democracy there? And as we have seen in the recent history, this experiment of democracy in many parts of the developing world, it doesn't go really well. So that's a really interesting area and worth exploring. We also learn from this book that wars that we see around us, they are not really unnatural or surprise events. Throughout the human history, wars have been constant. It's been a constant theme. Peace, on the other hand, that has been rare. This is the idea that Steven Pinker also talks about, that we take these things for granted. Peace, for example, your country not getting involved in any war is a rarity. And throughout human history, this hasn't happened. And one last thing that the authors remind us, that civilizations are not meant to last forever. At some point, they fall. But the good news is their achievements, all the things that they create, that goes on, and it provides for the foundations of new civilizations to come. And in some ways, that's an idea very similar to the Buddhist idea, that it just keeps everything keeps changing its form, and the universe is a transient thing which is related to each other. All the events and things, they are related to each other by cause and effect. So one thing leads to another and then to another. So imagine if you have to reinvent the wheel or printing press every few hundred years or so. Or if you have to invent democracy every year, what would that be like? That's not the world we live in. We live in a world where we have acquired all these things from the civilizations which don't exist anymore. And we carry forward the good things created by the previous civilizations, and we pass on that wisdom, that learning, that inventions to the subsequent generations. And that is how the world just goes on.